All right, here's the question. Ooh. Views on women preaching. That's all it says. I'm not just so everyone knows I'm not lying. I don't think you can see it. It's too glaring. But views on women preaching. I can go first. Do you?
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
I could answer it in like. Yeah, you go first.
Okay, so
it's not going to take long for me to answer this.
So no. I guess it doesn't take very long for me either. So here's the thing. This is for me. Let me explain. Maybe because I'm going to say no, but let me explain why. So I grew up egalitarian in the Wesleyan Methodist Church. Actually they pride themselves on being one of the first denominations to actually do this, aside from the Nazarenes. And so I grew up egalitarian. It was never a thing that I even considered. I never even knew that there was people opposed to it. And I eventually heard of complementarian somewhere around college, I think is when I heard about it. Looking into it, actually heard some people communicate it in a way that wasn't terrible, like, because that's usually how it's presented, and looked at scripture and thought, okay, wow, I don't know how I didn't see this or ignored it. But I think at the plain reading of scripture, aside from all the arguments on culture and context and the tipple of Athena and all of this other things that people bring up, I think scripture's pretty clear on what that looks like. In fact, I think I suggest this to people all the time anymore. If you want a really good book on complementarianism that is a very good presentation of it, Even Exile is an excellent book that demonstrates that in a way that doesn't
And if you're lazy, like if you're like me and you watch the Lord of the Rings movie and not and you never read the books, the documentary Even Exile.
I haven't seen that, so we're gonna assume it's the same thing. I'm assuming it's the exact same.
Yeah.
It's
complementary to the book.
But that's what I would say is that book does a really good job of explaining it well in a way that doesn't trash the other side. In almost every book that I've read as far as egalitarianism, complementarianism, it's always the other side. So there was another book, Biblical Womanhood by, I forget what her name is. Her book is for egalitarianism, but the entire book is basically just trashing complementarianism. Like, it doesn't even make its case aside from trashing complementarianism. So you don't find a book often that explains it well. All that to say, there's my sales pitch for Even Exile. But just looking at scripture, I think in a genuine, plain reading way, bringing in context and culture, bringing in what Paul is actually arguing for, looking at just if you want to just discount Paul, just looking at the ministry of Jesus, I think does a really good job of that too, showing how Jesus interacts with women, as well as how the Jewish faith is set up. It's one of those things that it seems, I mean, when you look at it, for me at this point, I don't see how you could pull out this idea that women could be, lead pastors in churches. But there are people that clearly do have that view. But that's my view. Views on women preaching is that I think scripture is very clear that the one role that is not open to women is that of pastor preacher. That does not mean, let me just clarify really quick, that doesn't mean that obviously they're not preaching the gospel. There's lots of ways to preach the gospel outside of the leading of God's church. So anyway, I mean, that's a lot of caveats, I suppose, to my answer, but there's where I stand on it.
Ditto.
Okay, there you go. See, he said it was short. He said it was short.
I think so I'll start by making everyone mad and just reading a couple of two verses, right? The two most obvious ones that would be used first to defend the no women preaching stands. 1 Timothy 2:11-12. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. That's what Scripture says. Now, the hate mail that is being typed right now, because I read the Bible. So even Exile does a really good job, right? And even the documentary, they they do a really good job of making the point that there are lots of trigger words in what I just read. Submissiveness, the idea that women should just be quiet, right? Like we think about some crusty old dude yelling that from a pulpit and all of the women kind of sinking down in their seats, right? Like that's not what's happening in that text. It's not how we should take it. Um it is years and years of feminism and influence of secular culture and influence of godless ideologies in our nation that have brought us to the point that when we read that, we automatically think, well, then women are inferior. Women are not as important. Women are, look, God made you with, I heard it recently called a superpower. God made you with a superpower to develop a child inside of you just by eating and stuff. Like, there,
Well, it's not just by there's a process before the eating and stuff that happens, but yes.
so I don't know if we're
Anyway,
gonna get that kind of question or not,
no,
but
yeah, maybe.
the it this the answer to that question is really easy if we're going to be biblical. Now, because of our culture and because of all of the voices in our culture, oh, certainly I could attempt to make up excuses and read things into the text and all of that kind of stuff. I can certainly do that. Um, but I think that's what it would be. It would be me reading things into the text or saying, "Oh, well, that can't be it." So, like homosexuality, right? It's the same thing. It's the same struggle with the text. There's something that to the average unbeliever who hates God, right? Whether they say that or not in their heart, who hates God, having a problem with homosexuality being a sin. Um, and uh, so they'll read that and Bart Campolo has some interviews. There's one of your crazy people from that
The
world,
progressive
secular
side, yeah.
humanism or whatever. Yeah. Um, but there are interviews with him that that have him saying essentially like I saw these things in the Bible, but I know some of them, and that can't be right, and so I'll make it mean whatever it's gonna mean, or it's just gonna prove to me that Scripture isn't really that binding. It's just a book. Um, so you attempting to make Scripture say something it does not say to appease your gut instinct or the culture or an uneasiness that comes with some sort of text is a dangerous road to go down. That's the answer to the question. No.
Gotcha.
But
And one thing, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, go ahead. I was
Well, I
just
was
going to
gonna.
say the reason the reason that we have the question is all the way back to Genesis. When that the just after the fall, when God was handing out the sort of um the punishments, the judgments, the what's going to happen now statements. Um, we know even from that Eve is going to be after her husband's authority and role the whole time, and that has happened ever since at some level. It's just that today we're living in a culture that not only that actually celebrates. Um, we're living in a culture that actually celebrates sin and and that sort of thing. So I just stop trying to be dudes. I
I sorry. One of the things that wanted to add, I think, is some of the reason that this is a thing in some places is because, and I think she actually mentions it in her book, in that Even Exile book, if I remember right. But some of the reason that this is even a thing is because there are churches that have been unfaithful in letting women do the roles that they are qualified for. And as such, there is this kind of undercurrent of let us do something, but now it becomes something unbiblical. And that's sort
yeah.
of from the book, that whole biblical womanhood, which is the exact opposite of Even Exile to the nth degree. There is some of that you read. Her hate for complementarianism, or what I would consider biblical teaching, is that she was told she couldn't do things. She was basically told to sit there and just listen. And she wasn't, to her credit, as much as I would disagree with her, the author of that book, and I keep forgetting her name, but I'm going to have to look it up as we're talking, but to her credit, she is very talented. She is very intelligent. And to tell somebody that knows they have talents and abilities, hey, just sit down and shut up, isn't incredibly helpful, because they do have things that they're able to offer. But because, what's her name? Allison Barr. That's her name. Beth Allison Barr.
Yeah.
But to say, sit there and not actually utilize the talents that God's given you is the opposite ditch to fall in. There is a biblical place where you can fall in, where, just as most of egalitarians would mention, well, Jesus had women in his ministry. Paul had women in his, yeah. There were roles for very godly people and godly women to exercise within the strength and gifts that God's given them, outside of what God has said not to do. And not how not to do. So there's this balance here on both sides that I think that you don't go to either extreme there. If you don't have women that are gifted doing things in your church, you're in the exact opposite ditch as if all you have is women on the pastoral staff. Like, it's the same problem in the different direction. So there you go.